Robert Timothy Wilkins was born in 1896, 22 miles south of Memphis, Tennessee. He was a mix of African American and Cherokee American Indian. His white Cherokee mom cooked for prisoners at the local jail. His father fled when Robert was 2 years old to avoid a bootlegging prosecution. His mom then remarried. In 1911, when a neighbor broke his guitar over his wife's head, Robert's mom bought the remains of the guitar and had it rebuilt for Robert. He picked up the blues, and he would play around as a teen. He started traveling and picked up influences from the traveling medicine shows. He took over the area with his playing. Now in 1918, he was called for service for World War I, but he wouldn't see any action and he would stay in the U.S. He then took on some jobs when he finished, and he would only play for himself, but learn and learn and learn. Then he was laid off, and then he turned back to music, playing all types. It was the African American women who got to sing the blues and get it recorded in the early 20s. The African American men were not allowed. They were not supposed to outshine the white man, so they were used in the circus and comedy acts instead. But then things changed. Money was a huge factor, and it was for the rich companies like Victor that wanted to change this style. In 1928, Victor would bring on some of Robert's contemporaries like Tommy Johnson, Ishman Bracey. These were trailblazers. Now, I'm not going to give a lesson on the blues. There are plenty of great documentaries out there that you should look into. In 1928, Robert met Ralph Peer, who worked for the Victor label. He was invited to cut 4 songs, after which Robert was invited to perform on a 1-hour radio program, making him one of the first black artists to make a live radio appearance in Memphis. A tune that Robert brought in was his own, and what is playing now is called What Else But Rolling Stone. This tune was done in 2 parts, a country blues tune. It's only playing 1 chord with a real funky tuning. It's tuned down, C, F, B flat, E flat, G, C. With the tune now being recorded, Robert became one of the big Memphis cats, along with Jim Jackson, Frank Stokes, and then also Ishman, playing all over at sporting houses and pig stands and hotels and house parties. It was huge on a Friday night after getting paid to go out to one of these pop-up locations and dance away. Robert would even go to the police station to perform. 2, 3 in the morning, he would entertain the night crew in the lobby. This was helpful to keep him out of trouble and be known. So now, the reason why I tell this story is having to do with the blues, of course, and how Keith, in '68, was reverting back to listening to the blues again. He would talk about how the Stones were just always constantly touring prior in the years before, and they were constantly on the road. And this is early on, and about 90% of the year they were just touring around. He picked up plenty from the bands that he was opening with, but he wanted to learn more and try experimentation. Yeah, he did know that early blues influences did use open tunings. In fact, when he heard Robert Johnson from Brian early on in their career, he would ask, That's Robert Johnson, but who else is playing with him? Not realizing there was only one guitarist playing one guitar. He thought there were two. But let's be certain here. Beggar's Banquet is open E or D tuning. Now, here's the bigger connection. Robert Wilkins would then go on and record a tune in 1928 also. It was called That's No Way to Get Along. The blues business went belly up after 1929 due to the big crash, and the businesses had hard times, and no one was buying records at that time. Owning these early 78s from this time frame are pure golden American treasures. This is what you look for when you go to tag sales or the charity shops. Welcome to the making of Beggar's Banquet. If you are new here and watching my documentaries for the first time and you got this far, that's great. I take many resources of information, books and books and books, and yes, some internet findings and talking, and I compile all this information in a timeline and bring this documentary to you as a fan from a fan. I know some of these facts I'll present are known already. Yeah, I totally get it. Some of you may not know it. For those returning viewers who've seen my documentaries, you're always welcome. I enjoy your company, enjoy your comments for sure. And of course, liking these videos truly helps it out and makes it more visible for other fans. Since my last documentary on Jumpin' Jack Flash, I've taken a plunge to request for PayPal assistance. Yeah, I had to. You could see in my description the information. This is helping me out. If you see value and you're getting enjoyment in my work efforts here, this takes hundreds of hours of my personal time to present this to you. So what was going down in the world as the Stones were working their magic? Well, the answer, plenty. Keith would say 1968 was a time of turmoil, and it was the first sort of international chaos since World War II. Confusion is not the ally of peace and love. You want to think the world is perfect, but you can't hide. You might as well accept the fact that evil is here and deal with it any way you can. So what was going on at the time around the world in 68? Well, in January, Prague, Czechoslovakia, it was known as the Prague Spring. A new Slovak politician was winner of an election. He had beaten a Stalinist. It was time for liberation and reform for the country. So what happened? The Soviet armed forces invaded and occupied Czechoslovakia by August, clenching a fist and reinstituting a hard-line communist rule instead. In January, North Korea, still on the edge since the Korean War. North Korea had captured the U.S. Navy intelligence vessel USS Pueblo and their crew. U.S. claimed they were in international waters, but North Korea disagreed and held the crew of 83 in a POW camp until negotiations were completed. What else? Vietnam turmoil. The Tet meeting at Lunar New Year. North Vietnamese Viet Cong forces launched a coordinated series of attacks against key targets in South Vietnam. The attack surprised the U.S. and would cause heavy casualties. This was considered to be a turning point in the U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War. April 4th, Martin Luther King Jr. is assassinated in Memphis while standing on the balcony outside his room at a hotel. His assassin was captured in London, James Earl Ray. Riots would ensue from this assassination.
That been done so long, now don't worry me. Don't believe I'm thinking. See what all I mean. You don't believe I lay down. Think what a fool I've been.
The riots weren't the only thing happening in the U.S. as turmoil, but there were protests against the Vietnam War and also rights. This was common throughout the world. Protests going on in many cities, countries, all over. It was a world full of protesting going on. And of course, the story does tie into the Stones. Much more on this later. Starts when you're always afraid. The man come on and take you away. Stop. Hey, what's that sound? Everybody look at what's going down. Stop, children, what's that sound? Everybody look what's going down. Stop. Hey, we got to stop. Look around. What's that sound? June 5th, Robert Kennedy is assassinated on the night of the California primary that he would win, and he moved on to getting closer to presidential nomination. And he had just addressed a large crowd of supporters, leaving the Ambassador Hotel through the kitchen. This was in L.A. He was shot by a Jordanian immigrant, Sirhan Sirhan. Sirhan felt betrayed by the senator's support for Israel during the Six-Day War. Gunfire exchange between police and members of the Black Panther Party in Oakland, California. We have the Chicago Democratic Convention opening in August. Thousands of students and anti-war activists and other demonstrators, yippies, students, Black Panthers, all poured into Chicago during the event. They were met with plenty of police violence and shown on the TV. Here we get to see what top albums, music was happening in 1968. You give me a bad look, you kept something on my mind. What movies were popular at this time? As Stones fans, we know this album has a dedicated feel and commitment to the Stones Foundation. They left the dock. They departed from the psychedelic and, more important, the pop song machine that they were developing as. They had a complete renewed energy and a vibe, and during these sessions they were in sync. And they knew the feeling and their goal of what they wanted to accomplish and develop. Starting in early March, Mick makes a purchase of an apartment on Cheyne Walk in Chelsea, London. He gets assistance from an antiques dealer who becomes friendly and has been for a while with the Stones, Christopher Gibbs. He's a socialite and pretty hip to the London swinging scene, which he supposedly brought about. In my research, I've got conflicts of Mick also purchasing Stargroves in Berkshire, a huge, huge mansion. It's supposedly bought in spring of 68, but also I hear in 70. Not clear. Anybody have details on the real purchase time? Let me know. Something to point out about Mick, that he became a literary student, doing a lot of poetry and philosophy reading and writing, and also growing more with culture as he's living with Marianne. Mick was buying books like Confucius de Cummings, French poet Charles Baudelaire, Dylan Thomas, Penguin Modern Poets, W.B. Yeats, the poems, Le Morte d'Arthur, Young, Volume 10. He would also start mixing up lyrical ideas from these. Socially, he was active and hanging out with the art dealer crowd of Robert Fraser and his contingency. He was not into drugs as deep as others. Mick would mention how creative this time period was and a real good vibe. He was also seeing a lot of theater as Marianne was involved and into that crowd. Shirley Watts would give birth to her and Charlie's child, Serafina, March 18th. In the Jumpin' Jack Flash documentary, I talked about the Stones, some of them down in the Redlands estates of Keith, doing some work. They did go to a rehearsal studio, R.G. Jones Studios, and also at Olympic Studios. They were bouncing around. Now, they were in Olympic Studios in London during March, sometimes in May, and then also in June. And in between, they were bouncing around and traveling and doing other things too. And we do know of Brian's decline during this time frame and his contributions. We're sure that Brian still had some bitterness between Keith and Anita. It looked as Brian was still hidden with the resentment of Keith, as he did invite Linda Keith, an ex-girlfriend of Keith, to move in with him in the London West End. According to Victor Bockris, Linda said their relationship was just really more about drugs and not about love. Brian was in and out, and when he was in, he was at times not focused. Nicky would comment. He would say that in the studio, Brian would seem to be very disinterested at times, sort of out of it and in bad shape. During Satanic, he seemed okay. At Beggars, he would have his guitar with him, and a short time later, he would be rolled over and out cold.
Miss Nicky Hopkins, and he's in no doubt as to which is his favourite album.
Beggars Banquet. I can't even think of any real reasons other than I was so totally involved with that album. And also, Brian wasn't playing a lot on that album, so there were quite a few more holes to be filled in on it. And he was playing on it, but not as much as he could have.
Now, instruments used in the sessions. Keith would use mostly that Gibson Les Paul, the custom Black Beauty, the one with his moon painting on it. He used it for rhythm and leads. the Gibson Hummingbird. The amps, a Vox Supreme, AC30, and a Triumph amp. Bill, a Sunburst Vox Dallas Tuxedo bass, also known as the Wyman bass. Charlie would be using the Ludwig kit and his small traveling suitcase drum kit. Important to know the transition here with Charlie. After the June Olympic sessions, he would acquire the Gretsch Model 4015 new drum set to be using going forward. Brian would use Gibson Hummingbird and a Gibson SJ200, the Super Jumbo. Also, as we get Nicky playing the organ and also the piano. When we take a bird's eye view and we look at the songs that they created, they are all independently different through and through. They have their own distinct recipe, and it displays where and what the Stones were going through, and at that time in 1968, a Stones musical soundtrack, definitely for that time period. What I'm going to do now is bring to you some of the outtakes and songs that were played during the sessions. I did some of this in the Jumpin' Jack Flash documentary, so that does have some of them. But the actual album's cuts will be discussed later, though. This next tune should be familiar sounding to you if you're privy to outtakes, never released officially, called Give Me a Hamburger to Go, also known as Hamburger to Go or Stuck Out All Alone, a Mick and Keith tune done May 13th to 18th. But it's just sweet. Sound is nice and clear. Now here is a little twist or a debate for what it's worth in the Stones community. Some believe it's Brian playing the bass and Bill on the bongos towards the end, or it's Bill on bass and Brian bongos, which would also add to the percussion list. Regardless, we got a song that could have been. Now I'm hoping as Stones fans, you heard this one, and maybe some out there who haven't, but Pay Your Dues, and also known as, in the original state, Primo Grande. This tune eventually turned into, yes, Street Fighting Man, and Keith on acoustic guitars and supposedly bass. People think it might be Bill. Keith on backing vocals, of course Mick, Brian on sitar and tambora, Nicky, Jimmy playing tambourine and clavs. Now Rick Gresh playing the violin, and Dave Mason playing the shehnai. From the band Family, again, the Jimmy Miller Connection, Robert Chapman and Jim King on background vocals. No Glyn Johns, but George Chikayans here. Now, this one was worked on in Redlands. Probably why George is on here, too. And also then an Olympic done at the rehearsal studios. It must have been great to sit and watch and witness Keith doing his experimentation with that Philips recorder and the lo-fi recording technique that he would do. So Pay Your Dues and Street Fighting Man are pretty synonymous here. Definitely more work put into Street Fighting Man after, but the base root of this, Keith recorded many different tracks and many capoed positions and tunings. Like I say, open D, open E. Not sure which was the final cut used. So I might as well talk about Pay Your Dues because that's the foundation of Street Fighting Man. There's a channel, Lee Flyer. She has a band and she's a Stones fanatic and talks about how she believes and saw they made Pay Your Dues and Street Fighting Man. And I took a few snapshots from her website. The first thing here you see is Charlie's Suitcase drum kit. It was a traveling drum kit, and I saw this also in the Exhibitionism, the roadshow from the Stones. They displayed this. And you could see the cracked drum head that was actually happened. They actually used it. This was the setup Charlie had started initially. And on the left side, you do see the cassette recorder. Now, from what I hear, it's very difficult to find and locate this Philips model that Keith used. She did. She found it, I believe, in Europe, and she had it repaired, and they shipped it over. And that's what you're looking now. She really wanted to duplicate the real same sound. The Philips cassette player didn't have any built-in limiters like the later model cassette players had. And that's what stops the distortion from coming out. So if you bought a later model to try, it probably was not going to work. There's a gentleman who has a YouTube channel called 12 Foot Chain, and he does some great guitar lessons. Great guy to listen to, pretty accurate, and knows his stuff, and it's fun to watch. And he showed a demonstration also on the recording techniques. But here you see the picture of his guitar, and he's just showing a microphone was placed inside, and the cassette recorder was going to be recording everything. And as you see in this picture, sort of a little cut up and pasted, the cassette player had an output. And what they did was after they recorded their session, they had the output going to an external speaker. It wasn't that small cassette speaker that they used. And what they did was they put a microphone right in front of that speaker, that external one. And from there, it went into the 8-track board. So this drum beat and acoustic overdrive of Keith, that rhythm stayed throughout the song. They kept the track there. And when you start hearing Street Fighting Man, there was overdub guitar, extra guitar work, of course, added. You know, when I first heard this song, and if you're like me, when you first hear it, it was the music you focused on and not the lyrics. Now, lyrically, this tune is about a Native American Indian chief. Hard to connect paying your dues with an Indian tribe and braves and squaws. But what I did find out at this time, the Stones' finances were a bit tight and or not available. Most of their cash was tied up and frozen, or it was being spent on court and lawyers. Many Stones fans think that it was only Andrew Lou Goldman as the manager, but no, Eric Easton was also a manager. He was older than all of them and experienced. When they would sign the Stones, the package benefited Easton and Oldham more than it did the Stones. Eric was recruited by Oldham because basically he was only 19 years old and he was not legal to have a manager or any type of agent license. So Easton was brought in to help along and, of course, more for the promotional PR side too. Now, Eric's job was booking gigs, some record producing, the fan club, but he also did all the legwork for the US 64 tour.
On the Rolling Stones.
Eric, you're the manager of the Rolling Stones, the world's most popular recording group at this point, right?
Well, that is correct.
How would you account for their phenomenal success?
I think because they've got a very different image from most of the other groups. It's a wonderful image. It fits in with what the teenagers want today. I don't think the adults go for them in a big way, but the kids, they think they're absolutely the tops. In England, they're the next biggest to the Beatles. In fact, they're equal with the Beatles. And I think before we finish this tour of the States, I think they'll be just as big here. The Rolling Stones have to be seen and heard to be believed. They don't become popular as a result of the record plugs on radio or television. When the young people see them in the flesh, that's it. They're the most exciting group in the world, and if the Rolling Stones are going to appear anywhere near where any American teenagers are living, they should go and see the Rolling Stones because they are fantastic.
How did this bad public image originally start? I don't understand it.
It's not a bad public image. The teenagers think the Stones are wonderful. It's the older people who resent the Stones. The Stones, they dress as they want to dress. They wear the hair long because they want to wear the hair long. It's not an effect. It's not done as a gimmick or anything like that. The type of music they play, the teenagers go for in a very big way, but the older people don't understand. And this is it. They are a teenager's attraction as opposed to an all-round attraction. And you get this terrific controversy between the older people and the younger people. And as long as that controversy goes, this is wonderful for the Rolling Stones.
So Easton, with the fiasco of the 64 U.S. tour, bottom line is he rarely knew either the promoters or the venues he was booking. To save some money, people were sharing rooms. And also, when he went out to visit Ed Sullivan personally, Sullivan eventually threw him out of the place. There was also that West Coast disaster with Dean Martin's show, Hollywood Palace. And Dean Martin went out of his way basically to insult them in his introduction. He was blamed for definitely a poorly organized circuit. The shows that they were saying, some of the New York shows were well attended, but they played into a lot of other small crowds. And, for example, when they played Nebraska, Bill Wyman would say, you could just tell they wanted to beat the shit out of us. Now, in 65, Andrew would decide to remove Eric due to the fiascos and problems that it had on the U.S. tour. Eric would eventually carry out lawsuits and make it the Stones, Oldham versus Easton. So I'm getting to a point here. Pay your dues. It was due to a breach of contract that would eventually settle out of court for a nice amount. So would this tune, this title, have anything to do with their circumstance? So the story goes with these lyrics, as you could see, some drunken Indian chief, he's beaten his wife up, an American Indian. What about the lyric, he beats his wife and made her life a total wet vacation? So I was thinking about this lyric and what it could be about. It's only guesses. So keying in on the words wet vacation is something that's miserable. I mean, who wants a wet vacation? So he beats his wife and made her life a total miserable mess. All right. Probably 3 guitars in Pay Your Dues. But when we hear the beginning, of course, it's not the best audio quality sound for sure. As we hear the guitars taking control in the first 30 seconds, along with Mick singing. Then comes that chorus, and it is just an ingredient full of instrumentation happening. It's full. There are so many layers in there, all of Brian's sitars and also his tambura. We got Nicky layered in there, most likely on the bottom layers, and Keith and drums and the violin. Can't make out some of the instrumentations, but It's a lot happening. Now, the guitar wailing. Now, we would think it's Keith. It is possible that that's Dave Mason doing the guitar solo. Really doesn't sound like Keith type style. Now that's open for discussion. You know, I'm not putting a stamp on it, but it is a thought and been discussed about Dave Mason.
Got the Monday morning feel. Monday wasn't really real. Oh, lying on a naked bed. With an Alka-Seltzer head.
Downtown Susie. I mentioned this tune in my Let It Bleed documentary. The tune Downtown Susie is also known as Downtown Lucy, and Bill wrote this song, and the original title was Lyle Street Lucy. It was started in these sessions. As I said, written by Bill. There's mention that Brian's playing slide on this, but it's possible it's Ry Cooder also, as he did have a little step into the Redlands at one point. It has a Dear Doctor vibe, a bit, a tune that the Stones fan can adore, and we did, as it was also put on the Metamorphosis album, the Arco, Alan Klein's label. You know that album. Why is it called Susie when it's Lucy that is mentioned? Who knows, as we all sit and ponder this mystery. But Lyle Street is located in the Chinatown, Soho area. It's known to many for a red light district walk-up. This one is capoed at the second fret, probably the Hummingbird, played in A, with adding some suspensions. Now Keith could be finger picking or just using the pick, not 100%, probably doing both, but very gracefully. Mick has his working class vocals here. The chorus has the chugging boogie, very Exile, and it's just a bit mesmerizing to listen because it's so unique. And that ending is very humorous.
With his heart screwed in. Yes, but it the shore. It's always life in an accident. Found it in the man next door. What exactly is gonna happen?
Family. There's 2 early takes. Covered May 13th, 18th, and June 28th. This one is really bizarre lyrically. It's about a dysfunctional family, Keith on acoustic and electric. There are thoughts of Brian on it, but not sure. Written by Mick and Keith. Do you know what I mean when I say these lyrics are thick? A lot of substance, a story for sure. Really heavy. Lyrics of a girl wanting to whore out herself, and it is her father to be first in line. A true beggar's vibe here in the early takes. But it did not pass the test. But not for Alan Klein, as it was on Metamorphosis. Something about the tune that does not sound complete. But these early takes that I'm playing, we hear the potential, especially with the rhythm anchor. In this tune, you know what I'm talking about. There's a pickup of the tune, picks up the speed, but then immediately it slows down. It's repeated also. You know this part when you hear it. It's a real strange twist.
I found his heart in the man next door. What exactly is gonna happen? It says with his transplant mouth, will my borrowed brain still compute the same, or will my daughter stop her sleeping out?
There is a last verse that says that he can't play guitar like E.G. Jim. Well, that E.G. refers to exempli gratia, which is meant as, for example. Jim, well, what is thought is Jimi Hendrix. The lyrics, or write St. Augustine if he tried. Dylan released John Wesley Harding in '67 with the song I Dream I Saw St. Augustine. Supposedly, Jigsaw Puzzle bumped this tune off of Beggars. There are 3 tunes from the session recorded June 24th to 28th, but there's no history or audio of these. A tune called Power Cut, Too Far to Walk, Thief for the Blues. I'm just going to leave it at that. Now, in April sometime, Anita was in Rome and part of the cast for the movie Candy, based from a soft porn novel. It had a huge cast. It had Marlon Brando in it and many others. Now, during this break in the studios, Keith would go down to Rome, and I want to say it was Mick and Marianne at this time that went with them. Both Keith and Anita would talk about Marlon Brando's experience. Especially Anita's talking about how he would try to seduce her. She did get intimidated. He was lying in bed one time reading her poetry, and she ran away. She ran away and went to her room, and there she would put on Satisfaction, and she was sort of blasting it. But he comes in and says it's really a load of shit. It's the drums that count. And he was sort of throwing his Brandoisms at her. She didn't end up with him at all in bed, but he was eyeing her the next day. Keith got wind of this, and that's when he quickly came down to Italy. So while Keith was there, Brando was kind of wicked and mean. He was sitting there putting his arm around Anita and smiling at Keith and playing some silly little games. And Anita would just say, okay, he fancies Keith. When Keith got wind of that information, he would just say, later, pal. Hence the name Marlon. Marlon, however, was not a Stones fan. In the book She's a Rainbow, it's talked about with Anita and how she did influence Brian, of course, with wardrobe and dressing and getting a look. And that's what she started doing with Keith also. Keith started wearing sporting neckerchiefs, bangles, rings, and necklaces, also putting some of the liners under his eyes, little mascara and lipstick and some nail polish. That's Anita. The album Sweetheart of the Rodeo was worked on but not yet released by the Byrds. It would not happen until August of '68. At the end of May, the Byrds toured England. This included their newest star-studded, fashionable country stud, Graham Parsons, the newest member, singing on most of the album's songs, but originally. Lee Hazelwood had signed Graham and his first band, the International Submarine Band. Hazelwood threatened for sure the Byrds due to they were under contract. So Roger McGuinn of the Byrds had to replace Graham's vocals on some of those tunes. Can't talk about this time frame without mentioning Graham Parsons, of course. And there's that story about the Byrds. They were going to do a show in South Africa. Mick and Keith would go see the Byrds play at the Middle Earth in Covent Garden. They would meet Graham after the show. They would get into Keith's Bentley and wind up driving out to Stonehenge with Graham, Anita, Mick, and Marianne, and Michael Cooper, all tripping and watching the sunrise while photos were taken of them. Keith had said Graham was special. If he was in a room, everyone else and everything he touched had magic to it. They would then transfer Graham to the Redlands, where the bonding would start. Keith recognized Graham's brilliance, and he wanted to learn all he could in the inside construction of country. Graham knew also that he could pick up the rock and roll side pieces from them. Keith mentioned Graham was just as fluent as Keith was in the upper echelon of chemicals, just like him. When they first met, Graham would say to Keith, "What do you got?" He had good taste. Graham did not learn about drugs from Keith, that's for sure. They both liked the finest. They both had a love for the U.S. South. Graham would know the cowboy songs Keith grew up with, and they would just have a blast. For those of you who play guitar, you know how cool and fun it is, and exciting, how to get turned on to tunes, the styles and techniques. And as the story goes, Mick and Keith would influence Graham to not go down to South Africa. It was not cool for bands to go there and play due to apartheid. So he quit the Byrds just before that tour going down south to Africa. Chris Hillman of the Byrds, it said the Stones got in Graham's way because he was a groupie to them. As mentioned earlier, Keith with his vinyl listening of the blues. Well, one was Robert Johnson. He was one of those listens. Johnson's album, King of the Delta Blues Singers, was released in '61. Love in Vain was not on this album. There were other bootlegs that came out in '67 and '68, though. Brian turned Keith on to this album. As Keith listened, he was in awe how there was that one guitarist only. So I tell this story here because Mary Ann was working on Mick to record a tune from Robert's album. They would focus on Love in Vain, as they both really loved it. As Keith was in the country mode with Graham at the Redlands at this time, he looked into turning into a country twist. Why just copy Roberts? Let's turn it inside out. Mick felt good how it was turning out. They would add extra chords, and a version that I could not find that was out there somewhere was made at this time, but I just need to mention it as it was worked on in this period. Love in Vain would actually come out in Volume 2 of Robert's albums in '70. On May 18th, the Stones will go see 2001 Space Odyssey opening up. And yes, there was some tripping going on there. May 21st, Brian is arrested for the second time at his apartment for possession of cannabis in his Kings Road flat. Brian is sent to Marlborough Street Magistrates Court, where he's charged. He also moves into the Redlands temporarily with Keith. Keith would say police knew Brian was a weak link of the Stones, and they could be broken through him. He was roughed up by them. Call it unfortunate timing? I don't think so, but Mick and Mary Ann are also busted for marijuana, getting busted on May 24th, the day Jumpin' Jack Flash is released as a single with Child of the Moon. Don't mix this next tune up with the Exile tune, Pass the Wine. This one is called Blood Red Wine, also known as Red Blood Wine, Blood Red and Wine, Blood Red Wine, May 13th to the 18th. Many Stones fans would have wanted this tune on Beggars, as is. Listening to this, you feel Mick and Keith's soulful passion and, again, using that word, brilliance. Many will say how this was a precursor, or it helped aid Sister Morphine as a close sister tune. Lyrically, it connects to Winter, with obvious observations here. This just stands out on its own. Appearing on Trident Mixes, the bootleg in the 70s, Keith on acoustic, maybe also Mick on acoustic, but it said that Brian is on this as acoustic. During the verse, we hear one guitar, and for the chorus, it's possibly that there's a second guitar. When Nicky comes in with Charlie and Bill, it sounds a little bit cluttered. Charlie's on the tom and cymbal crashing. It's not till the end of the song that he engages the whole kit. Lyrically, it is hard to grasp what Mick is delivering, but there are key words here to give us an idea. Love you, trouble, man, obsessed, don't make me cry, pain, snow lies heavy. Love it when Mick sings, 'cause there's a little pain inside.
Yeah, please don't make me cry, 'cause there's a little pain inside. Yes, my darling, are you kidding?
An emotional tune with some deep feelings. Standard guitar tuning, but slightly tuned up. Played A5 and D, G, A with embellishments, D, E minor. We Got a chorus with F sharp minor, G, A5, G, A5 again.
Well, that's two trains running.
Still a Fool, May 13th to 18th, then in June 26th to 30th. This song had some birth in the Redland Sessions, also known as Trains Comin'. A song written by McKinley Morganfield. McKinley was born in 1913 in Clarksdale, Mississippi. He was mimicking Son House and Robert Johnson at age 17. We know him better as Muddy Waters. I like to repeat this name and think about how it's one of the coolest names in all music genres. Friggin' Muddy Waters. Recorded on Who Else? The Great Chess Records in 1951. Little Walter, who plays harmonica, is playing the second guitar. He used Jimmy Rogers' guitar. Leonard Chess, he's on the bass drum. A droning drive of Mississippi Delta blues. Not a typical 12-bar blues, though. This one's unique. It's out of the box, one chord. Listen to the beauty of Muddy singing, and he's in unison with the melody. We all heard how this format is copied by the later copiers. Not one bad note played. This is what Keith heard.
Crazy, all of my life. Well, I done fell in love with another man's wife. With another man's wife.
Pure blues, right from the gut. What a presentation. The Stones would feel this. They would turn that page and inject the passion into the sessions. Keith would recall a story of how he made a pilgrimage to Manchester's Free Trade Hall. He mentions Jimmy Page was there also attending, but he didn't ride up with Keith. This was before they were all famous. Muddy came on and delivered as expected. What these blues artists do best. He did his first set wearing a pair of dungarees and playing his acoustic guitar. You could picture it. The second set, he comes out with the band, but brings out an electric guitar. Muddy got booed. They did not boo Muddy directly, but they booed the electric guitar. That sounds familiar. Keith would say how magnificent and thrilling the performance was, and it reinforced what he was hoping for. Still a Fool is one of Keith's favorites. I could only imagine the excitement of them playing and jamming to this tune. Their heart, their roots, and their passion, and why they are who they are. This was what Beggars was based off of and going forward. They interpret this their way and still bring vigorous blues energy. I call this a chin to the chest tune, with your eyes closed and your head bobbing to the rhythm. This version is clocking in at 10 minutes. Slow version is about 7 minutes. A live jam, and with Nicky tastefully doing it again. It's a fantastic rhythm section. Then Mick reaching into his gut and coming out from his second home, the Delta. Brian playing the slide here, is it true? There are still active discussions in the swaying of yes and no. Was it him or was it the other guy? It surely sounds so close to Little Red Rooster. Many forums say Brian. Now sometimes it takes one person to start a rumor and just opens up exponentially. I'm not saying it is not Brian. In late June, there were sessions going on down at Keith Redlands estate. Not a sophisticated studio. It was located in the garden and called the Fifth Dimension. Not sure the timing of these shots here. This is in the Redlands at the Fifth Dimension. And we do see Brian in some. And we do also see Ry Cooder. The Redlands was getting burglarized very often. Not until Keith put in a 7-foot wall around the house and the garden. The Fifth Dimension had a large main room which was the focal point. And George Kiantz set this studio up and wired it for sound and for recordings, and the acoustics were phenomenal, even for playing vinyl. Again, across this time frame, in these sessions, it would hold Jumpin' Jack Flash, Pay Your Dues, Parachute Woman, Stray Cat, No Expectations, Child of the Moon. This is what would come about in the Redlands sessions.
Oh, she's long. She's so long and tall. And she weep like a willow tree. And they say that she no good. She's alright. She's alright with me. She's alright with me.
Gonna go back to Jack Nietzsche again here and his Stones connections, especially recording around this time frame and later with performance. I could not find much information on how Jack could connect with Ry Cooder. Jack would stop in at the Olympic sessions while they were recording, and Jack had his performance soundtrack in his sight and around the corner as a project. Jack wanted to bring Ry along with him as he had intentions of he and the Stones jamming together. Ry supposedly would go down to the Redlands with them at some time, not sure. I found this in Stephen Davis's book, Old God's Almost Dead. Anita would say Ry came down to visit for the weekend. He was just passed out, I remember, on the couch. You can imagine his initiation to the club. He then would get up and play, and really good. He was a very quiet person, but then I was probably as passed out as he was. Ry would contribute briefly to the sessions. I have to peel off another layer. Jack worked with Neil Young, producing and playing electric piano and arranging Buffalo Springfield, Expecting to Fly. Jack played with Neil and in Crazy Horse. Jack would work with Neil August to October of '68 with Neil on his first solo album as he departed from Springfield in '68. This next tune, Natural Magic. It's a Jack Nietzsche tune, meaning performance soundtrack, his involvement. It's about 1 minute and 39 seconds long, and it's an eerie tune, and it has Ry Cooder on it playing slide, which he probably laid over sometime in '69, and I don't know all the involvement here, what the Stones actually did, but they do have this listed as one of the tunes they worked on. As you hear it in the background, it involved also, besides Ry, was Randy Newman, who was part of Performance, and he was working on his second album. That's why he had Ry Cooder in the studio with him, and also there's a fellow from a band called Beaver and Krause. His name is Bernard Krause. He's doing the whooshing sound of the Moog synthesizer in there. I don't know too much about this tune, but I'm just throwing it out there. I'm going to give you a little treat here, an interview later on with Jack Nitzsche. Very casual, very laid back, getting asked questions about his career. And the topic came up about the Stones in the studio, and this is pretty interesting, and how unique and different it was.
You say that working with the Rolling Stones altered your attitude towards recording.
Oh, boy.
Why is this?
Well, they used to go into the studios. I mean, when I was hired as an arranger, an A&R man would hire me and say, here are the 4 songs. There'd have to be 4 songs because that's what the union allowed. So you have a 3-hour session, you have to get 4 songs done. And that's the way it was. And I was just like a studio musician. I'd mark down the dates in my book and see how much I could fill up in a week, you know, and just arrange, do the same arrangement 100 times. And along came the Rolling Stones, who would go into the studio, and that was the first time I ever heard of block booking. I mean, they booked when they first said we booked RCA Victor for 2 weeks, and I said, well, what hours? And they said, no, for 2 weeks, anytime we want to. I'd never heard of that. That was new, and just the way they worked. It was like we didn't have to work for 45 minutes and then take a 5. If at the end of an evening nothing came out on tape that was worth keeping, nobody got uptight. They just said it wasn't a good night, we'll try it again tomorrow. They'd have a song written and they'd play it, we'd make record it, and it wouldn't come out quite right. They had the ability to not be so in love with the song or sit on one idea, but they could. They play it as a tango, they'd play it as a waltz, they'd try it a million different ways and have fun with it. Well, that was all new. Nobody in Hollywood ever was that loose.
Now, if you watch the Jumpin' Jack Flash doc, here's the bonus you get. There are some thoughts that Jumpin' Jack was about Jack Nitzsche.
Percussion, whatever was needed. It was really a group effort. Nobody was producing. We'd all go in to the studio, into the booth, and hear a playback, and all give our 2 cents worth, you know. But I didn't sit in the booth and produce those records. They produced themselves. We all did that. You know, Charlie didn't feel he was hearing his drums correctly, he'd say something about it. And that's how those records were made. No producer. Maybe that's a good idea. I'm glad that I had the opportunity to do that, to work with them. It was just a good fun time. It was probably one of the last times that I really had a good time in the studio. I used to look forward to that. When they'd come for 2 or 3 weeks and just block out the whole 3 weeks. And it's always fun to see them and get together and stay up all night and talk about old times and stuff like that. That's still fun. But they're still the smartest people I've met in rock and roll.
Why is this?
I don't know. They're intelligent, they're sophisticated, and all the groups that since then, I mean, not all of them, but most of them, especially the Americans, are so guilty of it, of all the posturing that they do on stage and try to live a lifestyle that they think the Rolling Stones are, yet they can't come close to understanding what they're doing. They're just mimicking something that they've read.
Okay, I'm going to come around full circle, back to Still a Fool. When you hear and listen to this tune deeply, you should hear and have your mind drift off and recognize this sound. sound would be part of the future for a tune called Midnight Rambler. This is another hot topic in the forums. I do feel this helped ignite Rambler. It's fucking chilling. All I could say is make sure you go back and give this tune a listen. Hopefully with those headphones and loud. Listen to all 10 minutes. It will transport you to the Stones flying high in '68 and where their heads were at. Mick would record this tune with the Red Devils in a session in 1992 with Rick Rubin. Very good tune also. This tune is called The Vulture. It's best known as Highway Child, also known as Highway Bound. I was reading up on a lot of different dates and time frame for this next tune. I'm going to go with the end of June at the Redland Sessions. And there are quotes and people saying it was done in February, it was done in July, it was done in Olympic Studios in March, April, but I'm going with the Redlands, and also Jimmy Miller present. Played in F, E minor, A sharp, A and D. What potential? A Keith riff, and Charlie pushing and carrying the bass with his drum. There is no bass. Mick is creeping into rock and roll's abyss here. That crunch, raw pureness of that early 70s Stone sound here, but it's still 68. That train chugging rhythm. Gotta love Keith's uncharacteristic chord climbs here also. Lyrically, it's open for interpretation. You could see and read this. It's thought that this tune was recorded in the 70s, of course early 70s, for Exile time frame. But no Mick Taylor, and why would that be? He would certainly be on this. So there's a lot of leaning over to the 1968 session. And drumming, it's really thought too that it could be Jimmy Miller. This next segment I'm going to play, it comes from a flexi disc. It's a telephone interview with Mick and some representative of King Records in Tokyo, and that's the distributor of London Records in Japan. This is titled Hello, This is Mick Jagger. It's been bootlegged all over, officially released when the 50th anniversary. It's London to Tokyo, April 17th, 1968, when this was recorded. Been restored. I'm not going to play the whole segment. You can go listen to this, sure, in YouTube.
This is Mick Jagger.
Oh, good evening, Mr. Jagger.
Hello. How are you?
Fine, thank you. Well, this is the King Record Company in Tokyo, which issues the London records here.
That's right.
And what are you recording today?
Today?
Yes.
What are we doing? Just absolute lunacy. Complete lunacy. We're doing some tracks for a new album.
It's for a new LP, is it?
Yeah.
Could you tell us what it will be called? I've no idea.
I see.
No idea. Last thing you think about. But I think of something to call it, but I mean, we're just doing the tracks right now.
I see. Do you have any titles for the tracks?
No, not yet.
Well, do you have any idea when the LP will be issued?
Well, we're finishing about the end of April.
I see.
That's when it will. So it'll be out in May.
In May?
Yeah.
Will this new LP be an extension of your last one, the Satanic Majesty's Request?
I don't think so. It sounds different.
I see, it
sounds very different.
Uh-huh.
They all sound different, or they're supposed to.
Is Mr. Jimmy Miller now your regular recording producer?
Yeah. Yeah, he's doing this album.
I see. And will he do your future albums also?
I should think so.
Uh-huh. What is your schedule, say, for the next 6 to 12 months? Will you be making any trips abroad?
Well, I hope so. I hope we're going to go abroad in the autumn.
I see.
I don't really know what it is. I haven't got my diary with me. I can't remember it day by day.
No, I suppose not. You must be quite busy, especially with the...
Carry on there. Just carrying on working.
What do you think is the future direction of your music?
Sideways.
With the ending of this part one, I hope I delivered for you. I hope I stepped up to the plate and brought it to you. You're able to walk away smiling, knowing a little more, and digging this record. As mentioned in the beginning, again, hoping you could make some donation to help me out here to move forward. It's all appreciated, as you see. Many hours. So get ready for part two. Photo sessions. Reviewing the album cuts and the details about the songs. Street Fighting Man and the deep thinking of what that's about. Sympathy, how that was made, and the movie itself. Marianne, the times they had in LA. I'm sure you're going to enjoy it. Just remember to keep listening and play it loud.